Your own home observatory is a game changer in astrophotography, and the roll-off roof observatory is probably the cheapest way to do it. I'm going to go through the process of how I made mine in this video, along with some fundamentals for whatever type of build you're doing. Whether that's converting a shed, a porter cabin, I've seen a shipping container used, some sort of like ticket kiosk. I myself used a caravan. So let's get into it. I'm Nugsy, this is Cheapass-tro. After building my DIY pier, I then constructed a kind of platform to enable me to use it, and put a roof over that made of a tarp to enable me to keep the scope outdoors, and therefore permanently polar aligned. This did drastically reduce setup time with no polar aligning, but over time I started really hankering for walls. I'm using a big scope on an EQ5 and it's very much affected by wind, even breeze. So I really started to want a proper observatory. Trouble is, I didn't have a shed. And I was looking at shed prices, and I was looking for a free shed as well. The cheapest shed I could find to buy was one of those little steel sheds. I could get it in about 8x8 for a little over £300, but with the cost of the other things necessary to make an observatory out of it, I was looking at overall about £500–600, and it would take a long time for me to get to that. And it took me embarrassingly too long to realise that I had just the right candidate sitting under my nose all this time. This old caravan. And when I say old caravan, I'm sure you'll agree it does not look much. It is certainly not fit for purpose to use as a caravan ever again. It was going to take some work, but it was also going to save a few £100 and provide more space than an 8x8 shed. Internally, this is about 12 or 13 foot long by about 7 wide. And this meant that, as well as the usual observatory space, I would have space up front of the caravan where it slopes down with the windows to sit in a little office, a little warm room area. Now, initially I had actually dismissed this caravan as being unworkable, and I'll have to show you the other side to show you why. Unfortunately, because I was working on this inside a barn, I couldn't really get a good straight angle on that, so through the magic of GIMP, I'll take this right hand side shot and transfer the door and windows from the other side across so you can see what I mean. And what I initially figured as too big a problem to overcome was the lack of space above the door. I had to fit above the door and within the thickness of the roof 2 beams with castors to actually work as a rolling roof, and there's just simply not the space there. I figured maybe I could cut the top of the door and have that kind of fixed to the top and use like a 3/4 door. Didn't like that idea, left jagged edges and all sorts. But I was able to overcome it anyway by shortening the amount of stuff I actually needed to fit in there. And we'll go through that. But once I discovered this was an actual workable project, first things first, I had to rip it all out, gut the whole thing. I'm not going to show you pictures of inside because it was disgusting. It was just home to spiders. It's been sitting there near 10 years, rotting away in the barn with pigeons shitting all over it. I would have thought that all these caravan internals were actually stapled from the outside somehow. When I ripped this lot out, I took half of the walls and chunks out of the ceiling with it. But hey, now it looks just as bad on the inside as it did on the outside. From this empty stage, I did have to patch up a few holes in the walls. I put basically boards of insulation in these holes. I also used this insulation board to block up some windows, because I'm not going to need windows in here. But now, being empty, I could work out exactly what I'm doing with these rails. It turned out that if I use 2x2 with fairly small castors, I could fit this where I needed it to be, as long as the bottom rail is actually lower than the top of the door. But fitting on the inside, that's fine. I just have to learn to stop bumping my head on the way in and out. The top rail is clearly above the door. Now, the actual castors I ended up buying, because I didn't want to buy too small a caster that was going to give a rough ride. I wanted a reasonable sized wheel with like a rubber coating, or tyre if you like, for a nice smooth experience when opening and closing, and I have achieved that. These wheels, however, or these casters I should say, I did need to adapt a bit, because above the actual caster wheel and within the bracket there was wasted space, and I couldn't afford that wasted space. So what I ended up doing was marking, drilling and grinding down bits of these brackets and refitting the caster in there to close up that space. I also cut into the top piece of 2x2 to again shorten the height of the caster, and this enabled the overall width to fit exactly where I needed it to be. So I fitted the bottom rail all the way around, and I say all the way around rather than just down two sides, because this is to form part of a framework to help the caravan out, because it's missing internal stuff now. I put some uprights in, squared off the framework around the top, and this helped where some of the walls were bowing out to tie them back in and keep the whole unit nice and straight and square. Then once I got the top rail in with the casters, at this point the roof is still attached, but I've attached the top rails with casters applied to the inside of the caravan. Only then, with the both rails actually fixed in place from the inside of the caravan, did I go around with a jigsaw with a metal blade and cut along the gap all the way around. Now, to fit this bottom rail, I've actually punched a hole or cut a hole through the front of the caravan, because that rail will then be extended for the top rail with the casters to run out and roll off. And with the top rail, once I'd fitted that in with the casters, I'd also extended that one out the back, because I know the roof on this caravan has a leak, and therefore decided early on that I would have a tarpaulin stretched over the whole thing. And just to give it a little extra protection, I want the tarpaulin to be wider and longer than the caravan, so it provides a bit of an eaves to make sure that most of the rainfall is not actually dripping down the sides of the caravan. With a longer extension on the front, so it clears a good portion of that slope in front and the top of the window seals. So at this point, I basically have an internal framework keeping the whole thing square and true. Both top and bottom rails in situ, with the casters embedded into the top rail, and then with the top rail cut all the way around, the roof is actually able now to open. Although the bottom rail at this point is still short, it will need extending once it's in position. It's able to open up by a couple of foot. However, because I've only gone round with a small jigsaw cut, I have to open up that gap for clearance. Now the walls of this caravan are made of some sandwich board. That is aluminium on the outside with insulation and then thin ply on the inside. So what I've ended up doing is cutting the thin ply and the insulation down by maybe ½ an inch on both the caravan and the roof portions, and then folding the metal back in. And once I'd gone around doing that, the gap is opened up to probably about an inch. I then went round with draft excluder, which is self-adhesive. It's a little over an inch long and it just sticks all the way around and covers that gap. Now with this layout, I have only got 2 pieces of 2x2 as the bottom rails, with the roof having 2 pieces of 2x2 with castors to run along it, but nothing to hold it in place. Most people, when they're doing the shed conversions or whatever, will use like electric gate runners with some concave metal wheels to run over like a V-groove, and that will keep it on track, so that as you slide open and slide closed, it's not going anywhere. In fact, Glenn from the channel Astrobloke put that rail down on one side with the V-grooves, and on the other side used wheels similar to mine with the tyre on it, and that will allow for any sort of expansion over the seasons. I tried a couple of ideas for keeping it straight and true, involving a smaller caster on the inside, and up front I put a smaller caster on the outsides so that it can't shift left or right at the front or at the back. I got rid of the little casters at the back. That wasn't working because I'm going to have a partition further up and it would have got in the way. So instead I just put another piece of 2x1 along the piece of 2x2, set slightly higher so that the wheel cannot fall in, and that keeps it on track at the back end. So once all that was done, and I've got now a working roof that opens and closes, I went round and extended the eaves that I mentioned earlier for the tarpaulin to wrap round, and then fitted the tarpaulin. And here's how I did that as a one-man job. Just tie it on in the middle at the back and stretch it out with ropes. It's basically a mix of screws and staples all the way around now, and stretching and pulling it taut and making sure it's all right. It did end up with the potential to form very slight puddles at the far front corners after it was all out in situ, but easily rectified just putting a bit of extra wood in there. So I now have a working roll-off roof. The mechanism works, it works nice and smoothly. Then to carry on with the inside, I needed to insulate it. Your equipment can survive pretty cold conditions, but it does not like a very hot day. I'm in Ireland, so it doesn't get very hot, not like many of you around the world experience, but I've been out on some pretty warm days so far, and it has been quite remarkably cooler inside, because I put up this just foil insulation stuff. It's basically like bubble wrap with foil on both sides, and it's amazing, by the way, how quickly one goes through a box of 2,000 staples when putting this stuff up. At the back of the caravan I actually put some thicker insulation board because I was given 3 sheets of this stuff, which is very handy. And within the insulation I have made sure, another important thing to factor in, that I have maintained some ventilation. Not only will there be a gap around the pier for obvious reasons, but that's in the floor, I've also kept some of the vents in the walls. I have put some extra netting over these to help minimize the spider infestation risk. I don't like spiders. I couldn't really do much more at this point in the barn. What I needed to do next was to get the caravan in position so as I could actually extend the rails so that the roof could open to its full extent, to be able to work out the rest of what I'm doing on the inside. And putting the caravan in position was fun. First of all, I had to cut a hole in the floor, and this is to drop around the pier. What I didn't show from the inside was I dropped some strings down through the hole, and they were attached at each corner of this hole, and at the other end of the strings, falling down through the floor there, I just tied some big steel nuts onto the end of the strings to weigh them down. You'll see why in a minute. But first of all, I had to prepare outside, and this obviously involved taking down my last platform. I'd already done this a while ago because I'd used some of the timbers to help with this project. I also had to move the pier out of the way because these big concrete heavy slabs that I'm using as a path had to come up and be moved as well and rearranged. So I rearranged those in a fashion that gave me a path between my mobile home and my observatory caravan. It comes along the back of the observatory caravan, and then I've had to make another extension to the path from gravel and chippings. So with all that done, and I've measured and measured and measured to make sure everything's right, I put the pier back where it should be, measured the width of the caravan like 3 times, measure 3 times, you know, can't go wrong. Yeah, I still went wrong. Brilliant. But the plan was to actually lift the caravan on a forklift truck with extended forks up and over the pier. And this is where you see why I put the 4 strings dangling down with nuts on the end. Because doing this by myself, no extra second pair of eyes on the job, I had to see that these strings were actually dangling around the pier correctly. So I was lowering the hole down over the pier. So anyway, yes, it kind of worked. I got it there, and all the blocks I'd measured so carefully were all in the wrong places, so I had to do a bit of jigging about to get it right. And as part of that jigging about, I ended up knocking it off the blocks as well, and in trying to pick it back up, I pulled a bit of the aluminium off the rear corner. I made a right mess of it. But you don't need to hear that, I'll edit that bit out. After a couple of hours of buggering about, I finally got the thing parked up and on its feet, on blocks. I got blocks under the actual axles because it's not to be suspended by these supports on the corners. So I took the weight off and they are literally supporting. So the whole thing is on like 6 points, both axles and all 4 corners. Leveled it up within reason, it doesn't have to be perfectly level. And yeah, it's nicely centered over that pier, in place and secure, finally. So the next thing I had to do was build a path because, oh man, it got so muddy out there. After all the rain we were having, I was getting wet to the knee every day walking in and out. It was terrible. But again, you don't need to hear that. Now in position, I took the rest of the 2x2 and extended the lower rail out to the barn, and it's actually fixed to the barn. To support the middle of this, because it is after all only 2x2, I put a crossbeam and an upright to that crossbeam from the drawbar of the caravan. And if at some point in the future I feel it needs strengthening up, I can easily just double up on it, treble up on it, whatever it needs. So now, with the roof being able to fully extend, I was able to then work out exactly what's what with the internals. And to show that next step, I'm now cutting to an older piece of footage Sorry, it was taken on my old mobile phone and it's using its microphone. Right, excuse the mess. Here's where I am so far. So the floor is back together. I've made a small circle around the pier so as not to induce vibrations. I've yet to cover the floor. I've just covered one of the two wheel arches, and there's a cupboard I got hold of that I was going to put out in the office bit, but it didn't fit. Rather than cut it, I just put it out here. Right, in the roof I've made this extra partition bit. So there's the seal at the back there, and then this bit, there's a rail I come across that already got this draft excluder stuff on it. And the idea is that now when the roof opens, it comes through. I'm stepping on stuff. Over this partition, and the draft excluder back there lines up with the top of this. This draft excluder comes and replaces this one behind there. So this little section is all nice and cozied in. Spider resistant, I won't say spider proof. Now, how wide of a shot can I get in here? I've got my doorway from the little office control room, YouTube studio bit area. Computers go in there, it's just there for measure it up at the minute. Big old L-shaped desk. Again, excuse the mess. And yeah, it's quite a decent space in here. I stand comfortably as well. When the roof is open, that, in fact, I think it has stopped raining. I might demonstrate while I'm here. Although, I'll have to cut my anti-head bump thing for it to clear that. So I've just undone the front latches. La-da-dee. Latches, latches, latches. Handle. Daylight. Oh, there goes some water. It'll be alright. I think there's a bit of sun out. Now, when this is lined up and these catches go back on, draft excluders in there, and that's that new rail thing I just showed with the fitted draft excluder in there. So I've got my cozy little office bit. Just needs completing, but I'm getting there nicely. I'm going to put laminate flooring here. I have counted up and I've got enough to do the living room and this. That looks like a big hole, but it's a vent covered in mesh netting stuff. This place has to be able to breathe. Not a bad little space. And this make a nice little observatory. So from this point on, it was just about all the finishing touches and padding it out, tarting it up. Starting with the laminate flooring. Out the observatory end, I put that blue underlay down. It's a nice padded thing to walk on, and it doesn't mind a bit of dirt. Into which I cut a flap that I can take out to help with wiring. Inside there's a 4-way adapter which powers some of the stuff on the mount, and the wiring from the pier runs underneath and back up through this pipe. I had to do it that way because I'd already put the laminate down before wiring, and I didn't fancy cutting a hole down through that. Otherwise, I went round padding out little gaps with extra bit of fluff here and there, and you can see there's the little stops to stop the castors rolling too far back when I close the roof. I still haven't varnished or stained the desk, but I have put in cupboards and a drawer. And all in all, that's a nice little work area now. Hey, you like my mug? Last but not least is the outside, because that was looking horrendous. I just got magnolia masonry paint and went over with a couple of coats of that. Not so much to look good, but just to hide how bad it was. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes it. Until I've done some more, but I'll show you if I do. If you have managed to make it this far through the video, congrats. This is my longest video yet. I hope I didn't bore you, and I hope I did cover enough. If I haven't covered something that you want to know about, please do ask in the comments below. I always read comments and always respond. I can't see me ever getting too big to do so. And on that note, I will leave you to it until next time. I've been Nugsy, this is Cheapass-tro. Clear skies all.